I'm Denise, I'm the Scottish one.
And she's a non-fiction editor. And I'm Louise, the English one.
And she's a fiction editor. And together,
we're the Editing Podcast.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Editing Podcast. So this week we're chatting about semicolons. And I have to say, this is probably the most misunderstood piece of punctuation in a writer's toolbox.
Yeah, and one of the most disliked, I think.
Yeah,
and I love them too. And that arises in part, I think, because of the confusion about how to use a semicolon. But I think this might be more so in the case of fiction. There's also something about its appearance. Some people have a real aversion to semicolons. They think they look clunky and unattractive. No, yeah. I'm not really sure that that's a good reason
not to use them. I know.
Anyway.
Well, let's start with what it looks like. The semicolon is that little mark that looks like a comma with a full stop on top. So we'll have a chat about what it does and then talk a little bit more about some of the objections that people have to it.
Yeah. So the first standard use of a semicolon is to separate two independent clauses in a sentence that are closely linked. Now, the thing to notice here is that it's usually the case that those two parts of the sentence can stand on their own. That means there's a subject and a predicate.
Yeah, so the subject is the person or thing that's doing or being something. So, for example, in the sentence, the fireworks lit up the night sky, the subject is the fireworks because it's those that are doing something.
And the predicate is the part of a sentence that includes a verb and tells us something about what the subject's doing or experiencing. So in that same sentence, the fireworks lit up the night sky, the predicate is lit up the night sky because that tells us what the subject's doing.
Yeah. So let's get two related independent clauses and think about how to punctuate them. How about I love tomatoes and red and yellow ones are my favourites. So the semicolon goes after the word tomatoes. And you could use a full point, but if you want the punctuation to show that there's a relationship between the two clauses, then the semicolon will do that for you.
Now, if you do use a semicolon, the second independent clause doesn't take an initial capital letter. So red would be in lowercase. Yeah. But if you used a full stop to separate those clauses, red would take a capital R.
Yeah. Now, the difference between using a semicolon and a full stop will be subtle to the reader in some cases, but that's what good writing's about in part. It's using punctuation effectively to show readers mood, connections, and power relationships.
Exactly, and that feeds back into our earlier example. It's about weighting, or more specifically in this case about parallelism, because neither clause is a consequence or subordinate to the other. That Denise likes tomatoes is equally weighted with her statement about which ones are her favourites. And I say that in fiction, and I think you'd probably agree with me here for creative non-fiction too, Denise, that a semicolon can really help to quickly bring intimacy to related statements because it's a much softer piece of punctuation than a full point. It's less jarring, though it's not as soft as a comma, which we need to address.
Yeah, I think it's that middle ground where it's showing that there's a relationship, like you say, like an intimacy or a relationship between these two separate statements. So you could use a comma to separate those two sentences. I mean, it's something we both see a lot in fiction and non-fiction, and the answer is non-standard to use a comma. And I'm going to avoid saying it's wrong or incorrect because that sounds prescriptive, but a lot of people would consider it incorrect without question.
Yeah.
And we will dedicate an entire episode to this. When we dare. When two independent clauses are separated by a comma, that's called a comma splice, and some people do have a real aversion to that.
And comma splices are generally frowned upon in formal or conventionally styled writing, not always out of snobbery and prescriptiveness, but because they trip readers up. I confess to being a bit of a splice avoider.
A splice avoider.
Yeah, right. I do. I think there are cases where they absolutely work fine, but on the whole, I think they trip. There's a tendency more for them to trip people up. And that's a good reason to avoid them, because people who don't know what a comma splice is won't be bothered, but those who do know are the ones most likely to get grumpy about them. Anyway, let's get back to semicolons. We said we were going to deal with this in another episode, and then before we know it, we're rambling on about them.
Yeah.
So the next use for the semicolon is to separate the items in a list.
Yes, and in this case, it's really helpful when you have a more complex list where the items aren't single words, but they're phrases and clauses that already have commas in them. So let's imagine you have a list that includes the following: red Ferraris, comma, all left-hand drive, blue trucks, comma, most of which were flatbeds, and green tractors, comma, some with flat tires. Now, if you want to separate those with a comma, the whole sentence is going to be really comma heavy and quite difficult to plough through.
Yeah.
And could lead to misinterpreting some parts of it. So if instead you separate them with semicolons, it becomes much easier to read.
And that's important, not just in terms of clarity, but also in terms of pacing. So commas are, as we said above, quite soft pieces of punctuation that often accelerate the pace of a sentence because we speed over them. Full stops do exactly what they say on the tin. They bring us to a stop. They moderate the pace. And semicolons are kind of a halfway house. They slow us down a little, force us to take stock of the clauses they separate, but they don't jar us to a halt. And especially in creative writing, you might want to think about that pacing, that rhythm, and how your little punctuation marks can help you to evoke mood through rhythm and pace.
I think that's a really good point, because I think sometimes people do overlook the power that punctuation has to affect those sort of changes.
Focusing on the rules rather than actually how they affect the writing and the reader and the reader's actually experience of that kind of mind's eye on the page.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Now, when I wrote about semicolons back in 2016, there's something I didn't mention, but we really should hear, and that's emojis. Now, these might crop up in fiction. I'm thinking perhaps in emails or texts, but I'm seeing them in academic writing too, particularly in media and communication studies research.
Yeah, so you might need a semicolon and a closing round bracket for a winking face. I'm not sure if there are other emojis that use semicolons, but anyway, let's move swiftly on to objections.
Yeah, good idea. So one of the objections to our lovely semicolon is that they're pretentious. Now, I don't quite get this. I don't think there's anything pretentious about writing that has clarity. What I do think is that too many of them in too close proximity can jar in a way that's not the case with the comma.
Yeah, I think you've nailed it. It's the same with colons. I suspect it's because both those pieces of punctuations have a top and a bottom. They're kind of more in your face, more invasive to the eye. And but on the pretentious thing, I've seen plenty of great writers, some of them really gritty crime fiction writers, and using semicolons to indicate parallelism really effectively.
Yeah, yeah. Now, in some of the editing forums, I've seen some objections to these being used in dialogue. What's your take on that, Louise?
Yeah, so the reason given by most objectors is that the reader can't hear the punctuation. I don't quite get this. Dialogue in a novel is just that. It's a written version of the spoken word. You can't hear an apostrophe or an initial capital letter either, but that doesn't mean that an author would exclude them from dialogue. I think that if a semicolon helps to bring clarity and indicate relationship in dialogue, then there's no reason why it can't be used there. What I will say is that there is absolutely no grammatical justification for excluding semicolons in dialogue, none at all.
Right, so like most things, it's a style choice.
Yeah.
If you want to use a semicolon and know how to use it, go ahead. There's no rule. The most important thing is to understand the power of it. After that, it's up to you.
Yeah, and some of my authors tell me they don't want me editing them in on any account, and that's fine. So if I think the prose will benefit from an indication of parallelism, I might try a spaced n dash or a close-up m dash, depending on what style of the book's written in.
Yeah, same here. And I think that's the beauty of punctuation. There are options and can cater for all preferences, really.
Yeah.
So that's it for semicolons. Now it's time for editing bites. This is the regular bit of the show where we each recommend a favourite resource that we think you'll find useful. So this week, what else could I choose but a little book of mine that I've read recently, and it's called Semicolon: How a Misunderstood Punctuation Mark Can Improve Your Writing, Enrich Your Reading, and Even Change Your Life. That's quite a claim, isn't it?
That's a really big claim. I don't think there's one. Well, I don't know. Yeah, maybe.
Well, you need to read the book to find out.
I do.
It's by Cecilia Watson. It's a slim little volume. It's got a beautiful cover, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. And some people actually said to me, because I tweeted out when I got my copy, because I thought it was such a beautiful book and I was very excited to read it. And I actually genuinely had some people saying, is that a whole book on the semicolon? How can you possibly write a book on a single punctuation mark? Well, there's a lot to say about it. It's been, as we've discovered in talking, there's, been a lot of controversy over where and when it should be used, but the history of it, she goes into the history of it, and it's really interesting. So if you're a bit of a punctuation nerd, like many editors are, writers, have a wee look at this wee book. Yeah.
I haven't got it yet, but I will get it because I love semicolons, and I'd quite be interested in the history of it.
Yeah.
Anyway, my editing bite is the National Centre for Writing's podcast, which you'll find if you search for NCW podcast. There are some amazing learning resources on there. Just a taster, tackling representation in fiction, writing crime fiction protagonists, finding time to write if you're a new parent, finding writing inspiration from tragedy, and Margaret Atwood's top 5 writing tips. So that's well worth digging into.
That sounds really great, yeah. Excellent. So we hope you've enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for listening to the Editing Podcast. You can rate, review and subscribe to us via Apple Podcasts, Spotify or whichever platform you prefer.
And we've put all the links we've mentioned in the show notes so you can grab everything there. Bye-bye.
Bye.